lecturer in geography, actually the School of Geography, but probably the department is Citizenship and Belonging in the University of Leeds, right?
No, the School of Geography, the department is the Faculty of Environment, but my position is Senior Lecturer in Citizenship and Belonging.
Right.
It's a bit complicated, but it doesn't matter.
She's a very interdisciplinary scholar, actually. She started as an architect, so there's one more mix to think about. She uses interdisciplinary approaches, sociology, anthropology, feminist and critical geography, combining a number of qualitative and visual research methodologies in her studies. The latest book is The Illegal City, Space, Law, and Gender in a Delhi Squatter Settlement. It's nominated to be honored at the Geographical Perspectives on Women event at the Association of American Geography annual conference. Probably happened already in Los Angeles, yes. Right? Okay, so we're really pleased to have her. She's one of our collaborators in this Worldwide University Network project, research project, Penn State, Leeds, and a couple of others you will meet in this group, like Argo Mohammed from Sydney, Randy Hawkins from Madison, Ellen Thurst from University of Cape Town, Francis, John Pabla from Bristol. So we are all collaborating, and Professor Datta was working with us the last 2 days, sharing the data she gathered in Leeds. So we are very pleased to have you deliver the keynote for us.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much, Suresh, for inviting me and making me deliver the keynote. I'm a bit surprised and also very flattered and privileged because language and migration is not my key area, but having discussed our data in the past 2 days, I do see a lot of relationships and overlaps between our research. So here goes the translocal city, in which I think language is strongly embedded, given that my research was about Polish builders, Polish and East European, but in this particular talk, I'll focus more on Polish builders. So language was a key issue, and language and migration, the intersections of that, come up from time to time. But given my interests in urbanism, and I see myself primarily as a feminist and urban geographer, although, as Suresh has pointed out, I don't have any formal training, and my training is a completely different discipline in architecture, environmental design, and planning. I do think I can, what I'm trying to do is bring together ways of thinking about migration, and particularly transnationalism, which is a big topic of debate in urban geography, migration geography, to think about those in a different way, perhaps, from the perspectives and the visual narratives that I'll present today of the Polish builders that I looked at. So my presentation today is really to look at the material, social, and cultural context of movement through a range of these mobilities or visual narratives of mobility of Polish builders in the City of London. And this was a research that I carried out around 2007 to 2008, and I've been publishing on that since then. So the reason I begin with the translocal city and not the transnational city is because London has been proclaimed and represented over and over again as a transnational city, as a global city. And I feel that in all of that, those narratives, London's iconic status, London's economic growth and prosperity is represented far more than the way that we can think about how migrants themselves create relationships which are often corporeal, affective, and material, and at the scale of a human with the city and the city spaces. And even if we talk about material spaces in the context of migration and transnationalism, we talk about these in terms of spaces of transience. So flyovers, malls, airports, railway stations, asylum detention centers, and those kinds of spaces form the quintessential spaces through which we think about migrants and transnational migrants' experiences of movement and mobility. So the reason I'm thinking about this as a translocal city rather than a transnational city, although transnationalism is the broader context in this case, is to think about the city itself as an everyday place, as not the iconic status or a place of economic growth per se, but rather as a mundane and everyday space of negotiations, of mobility at all scales and at all different levels. So the city, therefore, and the city is important, of course, because it forms the key site of negotiation of these differences, particularly because London being a city that has been shaped by migrants. So London is significant as a city of migrants, and as a city that, therefore, through its many facets, provides the layers of migrant experiences that are highly spatial, corporeal, and material. So that's how I think about the translocal cities. So mobility, embodiment, and visuality, and I'll come to the notion of visuality very soon, becomes the key elements through which I'm going to talk about Polish builders' experiences in London. Oops. Okay, so I'm just going to start with this particular narrative because I think, again, it shows, at least to me, the kind of things that I'm really interested in talking about, the ways that we can think about the global city, not necessarily as global, but made through local connections. So this is Adam, and he began talking about London. One of the first questions that I would ask my participants, and I'm going to talk about methodology in a minute, so don't get worried, but one of the first things I would ask my participants is, what did you think about London? And so they began describing a lot about their first experiences, sometimes shock, sometimes similarities, and those kinds of things. But this particular migrant, Adam, and many of the others, in fact, and I would say almost all of the others, would describe London not just as London per se, which was there in the narratives, but also as particular neighborhoods. And Adam says that where he moved in first when he came into London was Green Lanes. And for those of you who don't know, Green Lanes is a North London neighborhood, which is primarily Turkish Cypriots, and some Greek Cypriots, but mainly Turkish Cypriots, and delicious Turkish food and Turkish shops selling all kinds of Turkish products. And so Adam moved into North London in Green Lanes. And what he says is it was really convenient. You could go out in your slippers, put the rubbish there, and of course in terms of shopping, we lived just above the off-license. So quick shopping was not a problem. To a Turkish shop and bought everything. But most of all, he knew us well, the shopkeeper. Sometimes we even got discounts. Lots of Polish people lived there, and of course, most of these Turkish people who knew me. At the baker's, everyone knew me. I always used to buy there, just around my house along the main street. In Green Lanes, everyone knew me. So when they saw me, they even stopped me in the street to have a chat or joke always. They just treated me. I don't know, as if I met some friend in my own neighborhood in Szczecin in Poland. And the same atmosphere, similar. So the reason as I said, I'm putting this forward is to just set the scene in terms of what I'm really getting to in the context of this bigger transnational mobility going from one national territory to other. There is also this, at an everyday mundane level, there's also this negotiation of urban spaces, particular neighborhoods, and in the ways that they're compared between home left behind and a home that's been made in this new city. So the comparison between one's local neighborhood in Szczecin and Green Lanes in London. So it's made, the home and notions of belonging are being made through local or translocal connections. So I think it's important to set it in that context of this transnational space. So what am I trying to say here, which is essentially a critique of transnational space, but not necessarily saying that we need to leave transnationalism behind, but rather saying we need to think about localism or translocalism as a parallel concept to transnationalism. And this will become evident again with another picture that I'll show. So transnationality has often been talked about as something that is across and beyond national spaces. And there's been a lot of research on that, and particularly the emerging body of research, which is heavily qualitative and talks about migrant experiences. But I think most of that, it would be fair to say that it takes national or nation as a primary point of reference. So the nation forms the primary scale across which the negotiations of migrants' experiences are being debated and discussed. And again, this might sound odd, perhaps, coming in this particular context where people are looking at very small issues like English language negotiations, but perhaps I'm coming from a different disciplinary background, which is in geography, particularly in transnational geography, nation is the primary point of reference. So the focus often has been on economic and demographic changes of sending and receiving countries. And yesterday we were talking about how migration studies itself looks at demographics, at big data in terms of how many people have moved, the number of remittances that's been sent, the development initiatives that have happened, and so on. And I mean, this image here is kind of representative of not necessarily that, but necessarily the notion of negotiation of migrant identities through particular national landscapes. So Guardian, the newspaper in UK, which is more or less a left-leaning newspaper, they ran this campaign because of this heightened media scare across UK at the time of EU expansion in 2004. They ran this campaign to show that migrants, Polish migrants or East European migrants who come into UK actually also contribute. And so this was this image of Piotr Dobroniak, who in Poland was a well-paid manager, and he's come into Britain as a laborer. And this was the general narrative that was presented as a counter-narrative to the narratives of, oh, they're taking our jobs. So, but I think in all of that, there's the migrants' economic practices, the social networks, entrepreneurial agencies, and diasporic belonging, all of that which is being discussed in a popular narratives or in wider societal narratives refers again and again to the nation, an imagined or actually existing nation. And this is, again, one of the Guardian images where they showed a map of the UK against which the different roles that Polish migrants perform are shown. And again, it's very economistic. It's about their economic contribution to British society. So it says suddenly everything has gone Polish, a special issue on the 1 million Poles in Britain, to show really that these are not scroungers, they're not taking a jobs away, they're performing essential roles and important roles in the communities that they are in. So what can geography contribute to that? Catherine Mitchell in 1997, actually quite some time back, she called for a geographic imagination to be inserted into transnationality, and her concern was that transnationality has become very deterritorialized. It's become very detached from local situated contexts, and it's evident in the ways that migration and transnationality is focused so much on national frameworks, on economic exchanges, and so on. So the spatiotemporal construction of migrant experiences, Catherine Mitchell suggested, was very, very important to take into account how migrants themselves understand their own roles, their own experiences, not necessarily always from a national perspective. So we arrived at the concept of translocality, and again, this is an image that was taken by my participants. All the images, by the way, that I'll show are taken by participants. And when I asked why he took this picture, he says this.
I don't want to picture, big banners and it's common, Everyone took it, so why should I?
Yeah.
Something interesting, something different. You don't have to be like everyone else. Yeah.
That's a really interesting point.
We were trying to show our lives, or not.
You've done really well. Yeah. Okay, so. This is another participant, and again, I mean, these are the narratives which emerge again and again in the interviews and the visual narratives that I took with the participants, that they were not interested in showing the iconic city, they were interested in showing their everyday lives in the city. And to a certain extent, it was a counter-narrative to the bigger pictures and the bigger narratives of the global city. So, what is translocality, and how am I reinterpreting this in the context of the city? Now, translocality is something it's a concept that has been going around for a long time, and particularly people like Arjuna Padarai, Ulf Hannes, they've been talking about translocality, particularly in the context of virtual connections and social networks. And they really present translocality as a very decentered and deterritorialized field, it is between and across locales, but they really say that it's not necessarily always across physical localities. It can be virtual connections. I'm taking my cue more from people like Michael Peter Smith and Guarnizo, who wrote about translocality as a subaltern strategy of transnationalism from below. And this is coming more from the urban geography perspective. And they suggest that translocality exists as a form of local connections that is both physical and imagined and social and all of those kinds of things. So it's not necessarily deterritorialized. It's highly embedded and situated in local contexts. So while for Padra and Hannes, the local global connections is what signify translocality and therefore a more virtual sense of connections, for Michael Peter Smith, it's a local connections that make up the experience of transnationality or transnationalism from below, very similar to the first slide I showed of Adam talking about Shenzhen and Green Lanes. And therefore, what I want to explore this is the situation in transnationalism studies about the embodied and affective and material connections which have been less explored in the context of localities, in the context of translocality. And to see how these mobilities that are not necessarily always virtual, but to understand how these mobilities that are not always part of virtual or travel across national spaces, for example, migrants, how they live their lives in London and how they are mobile across urban neighborhoods in London, for example. So in the context of this, how do I see locality in the context of translocality? So locality for me is a socially constructed space which is simultaneously material, meaningful, and symbolic, and connected to a range of other spaces and places through mobility, movement, settlement, and resettlement. And if you think about locality in that sense, locality doesn't necessarily confine itself to a particular scale of the home or the urban neighborhood. Locality itself is being renegotiated. So at a certain point, it can be a nation as a locale, as negotiating translocality, but at other times it can be urban neighborhoods that is the point of the locale. So it depends, it's a spatiotemporal construct in the ways that migrants' experiences negotiate their lives in the city. So following on from that, the translocality or translocal city follows out from the assertion that translocality draws attention to the multiplying forms of mobility without losing sight of the importance of localities in people's lives. So, as I said, the way that translocality has been argued by Hannes and Appadurai is that local, or the material sense of the local is less important in people's lives now, given the virtual social connections people can make. But I'm arguing, just like oceans shine, that they're both equally important. And even virtual connections are highly embedded in particular locals, in particular physical places. So homes, neighborhoods, streets are part of the situatedness of mobility and movement. So therefore I'm thinking more about the notion of habitus rather than the notion of ethnoscapes. And ethnoscapes is something that Appadurai represents in terms of these highly controlled urban ethnic neighborhoods in which the state, he suggests, rages war against migrants. So instead of that negative perspective of urban neighborhoods, I want to think about habitus, which is, again, a much more fluid way of thinking about homes, neighborhoods, and different scales of situatedness and mobility. And this brings forward, therefore, the temporal nature of the translocal city, that the city itself is highly temporal in the ways that it's experienced and understood. So there's shifting connections between transnational spaces, state structures, and the spaces of migrants' everyday agencies. And therefore, the translocal city is a city where local connections are made, both within the city, but beyond the city and beyond national spaces. And these connections are part of the embodied journeys through time and space. And it draws from this notion of new mobilities that has been proposed by Scheller and Urry to extend mobility beyond transnational movement that shapes the constructions of subjectivities. So migrant subjectivities of everyday lives is shaped by these notions of mobility, which is both urban and local and global and national. But they are situated in everyday lives in different times and in different spaces. And in doing so, what I'm trying to do is to critique the notion of the global city as a site of economic exchange and to really present the ordinariness of the translocal city in the lives of migrants themselves. So, where does visuality play a role in this? And why am I interested in visual narratives of the city? One of the things that was very important for me is to try and understand how migrants see the city on their own. And this is where language plays a role. Most of these migrants do not speak English in the way that would be able to articulate their sense of urban spaces and what they understand of London. So very early on, while planning the research, I decided to use pictures and photographs. And this was really for them to speak through images about their feelings when they came into the city. So it was both a form of overcoming the language barrier that we had. I mean, some of them didn't even speak in English, so I had to use a translator who was Polish. So the photographs, for me, formed a way to cross the boundaries of language that we had and which we couldn't speak sometimes with each other. But also, beyond that, I thought photographs were useful because they reveal something about the world and the people and places in it, and all the meanings and associations we conjure up, as Haywood would say. And what I mean by that is photographs are really snapshots in time and space, and they're also very embodied and material. And so therefore, they showed particular spatiotemporal locations of the migrants themselves within parts of London in a way that I couldn't have gathered because I wasn't able to follow them around. And so therefore, visuality for me became a methodological and analytical starting point for investigating their everyday lives in the city. And why was it important in the context of the city? And I mean, of course, I would say that being an urbanist myself, but I think cities are interesting, particularly in context of migration, because they are socially constructed spaces, and you'll see them as I go through this presentation today. In terms of the imagined sense of London, imagined idea of London that the migrants had before they came into London. So they are socially constructed spaces, but they're also material and meaningful and symbolic. And they are connected to a range of other spaces and scales during mobility, movement, settlement, and resettlement. And photographs that the migrants took for me was a way to capture that. And they also, as I said, were a tool to trigger conversations about things that was not immediately obvious to me or to them, but allowed to explore some of those issues that wouldn't have been apparent had I just done a straightforward interview with them. So photographing everyday urban life then is about constructing a spontaneous relationship between embodiment, subjectivity, and mobility through the camera. So the camera itself formed a kind of lens through which I could see parts of the migrants' everyday lives. So what did I do? I had a first interview with the participants, and in that interview, it was sort of a very, very basic interview in trying to garner information about how they came, what they thought of London. So basic information around their experiences and so on. And at the end of it, I explained the purpose of the research and gave them a disposable camera. They could keep the disposable camera for about 2 to 3 weeks. Some of them kept it longer, and take pictures. The criteria was that they should take pictures of their everyday lives, anything that was interesting, anything that they wanted to talk to me about in the next subsequent interview. So they sent the cameras back. I developed the photographs, and then we had another interview in which it was primarily about the photos, to talk about the photos, why they took it, what the photos show, whether it evokes any meanings, memories for them on reflection. So the way that I saw these photos was, as Michelle said too, would talk about spatial stories, because these photos were essentially stories of their embodiment in time and space within London. And sometimes some of them actually even took it across the channel or with them to Poland. So I got even images of their homes and neighborhoods in Poland to compare with what they took in London. So they're really spatiotemporal stories rather than just spatial stories. So they're embedded in particular spaces and times. And what it allowed them to do is to question the taken for granted aspects of their lives in the city. And many times it was, when they saw the photos, they said, you know, we never thought about it like this. And just looking at these photos makes me think about the contrasts that I have been embedded in, or some of the assumptions that I had taken for granted before I came into London. So some of the taken for granted aspects of their lives in the city, and they became therefore quite reflexive on looking at these pictures and talking about these pictures, about the processes through which their embodied experiences were shaped in London itself. And Michael Krang, he talks about photos as spaces of vision and observation, and definitely that was the case, because these were really not photos that had any semiotic status per se. So they weren't interpreted for what they were and what they were showing by myself, but they were really interpreted in this kind of relationship, researcher-participant relationship in the context of the interviews. So there was no other semiotic analysis or social cultural analysis, the photos done before and after that. At another level, I think what the photos also do is displace the authentic representations of the global city. So if you see pictures of London, you see pictures of Big Ben and London Eye and the Tower Hamlets and so on, and none of those images figured in the participants' pictures. And so it displaces this public photography that exists of iconic cities and of global cities, and produces a very mundane image of a global, everyday, ordinary city. So the participants, they were circular migrants. They had traveled to other countries for work. They had gone to the USA, they had gone to Australia, Sweden, Cyprus, France. They were well traveled. And some of them had actually traveled a lot within Eastern Europe before Solidarius, when the socialist governments broke up and changed, and they changed into more capitalist systems. So they had even, during the socialist time, they had even traveled around Eastern Europe. Most of them came from smaller industrial towns like Białystok, Szczecin, Tarnow, Lublin, Torun, Nowa Huta. So they were not coming from big towns like Warsaw or Krakow, although there was, I think, a couple of participants who were from Krakow. But again, they were from the suburbs in Krakow. So they all came from small industrial towns. They all came because they had social networks. They knew people who'd come before, and through them they had come. So very similar to the other migrant stories. They came to London via land, sea, and low-cost airlines, and this is going to be very significant in the way they see London later on, as you will see. And they had moved around between home and work in London. So as I said, I think in transnationalism research or migration research, we're really interested in the home country, country of origin, and country of destination. And we think that once they reach the country of destination, life ends, unless it's a big issue about race or racism and some kind of event or crisis that happens. But I think what's interesting here is that even after moving to London, in a very mundane sense, they were highly mobile. They were making huge numbers of changes in accommodation. And this was to do with the kind of work they did, because these were Polish builders. They were builders, and the building sites, if you think about, are actually located across the city. So their concern was all the time to stay close to the building sites. And they weren't really buying property or renting in a very formal sense. They could move very easily. So the movement and mobility within London was very high. So yeah, it was related to the spatiotemporality of building sites. And also what's interesting is if you see this map, this shows the boroughs in London. The darker colors are where most of the migrants were. And this is actually from a study that was done in Oxford Migration Institute. So it's not my data, this particular map. But it shows where most of the migrants, Eastern European migrants who came, and this included also not just builders, it included care workers and so on, so a broad range. But it definitely tallies with what my participants were telling me, that they were actually moving into those boroughs which are of cheaper rents. But the boroughs which are of cheaper rents are also boroughs which have high ethnic populations, ethnic minority populations. So this is something, again, to keep in mind as we go through this presentation. Okay, so this is just one example of the heightened mobility that the participants had after they came to London. So in 2001, this particular person, he came to London, came for 5 months. He stayed in a 3-bedroom flat and shared the room with a Polish friend, and this was in Hoxton, which is kind of northeast London. In 2002, for 1 year, he stayed in another 2-bedroom flat with an English friend. This was in Camberwell, which is south. 2003, for 6 months, he went back to Poland. 2003, then again for 3 months, he went to Cyprus. And then 2004 is a time when the EU expansion happened, and the 8 countries, the 8 Eastern European countries joined the EU, when they could legally come to the UK to work. So before this, he came and he was working illegally. And so he went back just before 2004, and he came back in 2004 as a legal migrant to work in the building sector. So he came and he stayed for 14 months in a 2-bed flat with a Polish girl in Camberwell, then 5 months in another 2-bed flat with his Irish colleague or the Irish contractor who gave him the job to work in the building site. In Camberwell, then 3-bedroom house, shared room with English strangers. In 2006, then he rented from his Polish employer. He worked for a Polish contractor in Lewisham, which is again South London. And then at the time that I took his interview, he was in Leytonstone, which is again East London. He was staying in a house with his other Polish friends, and all of them were builders in different construction sites across London. So I asked him why he had to move so many times, and he said, work. I had to move to Lewisham because I had such a deal with my partner, my business partner, that it was easy for me to live there because we were getting to work by his car. We got on the car and went to work. And why did I move from Lewisham to here? Because it was very expensive. It cost £80 a week. Let's say I could afford it at the beginning, but then work began to be a bit problematic, and I decided that I had to change it. And at the same time, my friend let me know that one room in their place was vacant, and I thought that I'd have a look. So generally speaking, it's about work or money. So work and employment was very closely related to the house mobilities that they'd had. And this is, again, interesting because in the context of building work, those of you familiar with the kind of building sector, particularly this low-skilled work that people do in building sites, it's usually cash in hand. There's no formal contract, so you can let go the next day, and you just move from one side to the other depending on what kind of work is available. So nothing is secure, and therefore home itself can't be secure and have to keep moving with that. So now some of the images of the city itself was interesting because of the way that the city was talked about was not, as I said, not as a global city or an iconic city, but a city often that was disappointing. And this disappointment has to be seen against the context of what London had meant before they had come to London, what London had meant both in the socialist period but also after the socialist period, when many of them aspired to move to the West. Oops, why is it moving on its own? So London's position as a global city was of particular importance in the social and cultural subjectivities of these participants. And therefore it shaped how participants made sense of London itself. Because during the socialist regime, restrictions of access and control over their movements into what they understood as the West had shaped how London had been constructed in their imaginations. So until the fall of communism in 1989, most participants had never traveled to this West. They had traveled around Eastern Europe, around the socialist countries, but they hadn't actually stepped into the West. And London for them was actually the symbol of the West, of modernity, and all of that. And a few older participants suggested that they had always thought about London as an aspiration, as something that Poland would never be able to achieve. And in this context, London for many years had been this cultural symbol of the West, a city at the heart of English culture. They always talked about it as English culture. The fact that in the black market, they found things like Shakespeare, and they read Gerald Durrell, they surreptitiously found CDs of the Beatles, and they listened to it. And so this was the English culture that they had imagined before coming to London. And this culture had been largely forbidden during the socialist regime. And one of the participants actually said that if something is forbidden, then it becomes even more attractive to you. So when it opened up in 2004, most of them wanted actually to come to London, not necessarily to UK, but London had such an image in their mind that they aspired to be part of London and London's notion of becoming part of the West and of modernity. So in the past, London had been the city of dreams, which had been denied to them by the socialist state. And before EU expansion in 2004, the journey into London had been fraught with difficulties because they used to keep coming, and they wanted to come on the passports they showed as coming as tourists, but many of them were actually sent back because the immigration officers didn't believe. And when they were allowed in, they continued to work illegally on a tourist visa. And they had these middlemen, so they were robbed along the way. So they had lots of difficulties, but after 2004, it opened up. But once it opened up, what they experienced of London, I don't know why it's going through the other one. Anyway, so once they experienced London, it was a city of disappointment because if you remember the map that I showed you earlier, they came into London and they went and they lived in these ethnic minority neighborhoods, and this was not the London that they had imagined. So many of them talked about London as being this divided city, the city that divided between the iconic city of London and what this image shows, the welcome to Leytonstone. This is welcome to East London, welcome to the ethnic part of town. And this is where they were staying in. So they saw themselves as separated from the success and global city status of London. So what I'm going to talk about again is how these notions of separation, alienation, aspiration, and all of that were negotiated in these particular sites that the migrants or the Polish builders were in. And the building site was perhaps one of the key sites where difference and identity and their experiences or these subjectivities were being negotiated. And the building site was interesting because on the one hand, they were white migrants. So their experience was very different from, let's say, Asian migrants or African migrants who immediately were perceived as different from their skin color. So they did suggest that it was easier for them to find jobs in building sites given that their skin color was white. But at the same time, they said that because of the language difficulties, they were often at a disadvantage. So most of them, even if they were working in other sectors and they came into London, they began work in the building sites from the lowest level, which was at the laborer level. And so then immediately you start getting to see the hierarchies that begin to emerge in terms of English-speaking workers at a higher level, at a manager level or at a supervisory level in the building sites, and the really lowest level, which is the non-English speaking Polish builders. And it was here that they began to articulate a sense of difference which was based on the Polish builder's body being superior in being able to perform the work better than the English builders. So there was all these narratives about we have more finesse as a nation. We do better job. We are more concerned with actually cleaning up after ourselves in the job. So there were lots of narratives which I don't have the time and the scope to go through. But it was really always a valorization of the Polish body, and the valorization of the Polish body in all its dirt and the filth, which is very different from the way the Guardian article represented Piotr Dobroniak in this clean person standing outside the building site. And in there was always this notion that English was a very important language as a cultural capital, as a route to cultural capital, as a route to articulating their social mobility, or allowing or encouraging their social mobility. So while in the building site, of course, there was not enough time to socialize, but they did realize that they needed to get a better grasp over English. After the day's work was over, those who were really aspiring to social mobility within the building site, who wanted to really go up the hierarchy, would go with their English colleagues to the pubs. So this particular participant, he says, I prefer English pubs, and I prefer to go to the pub with English people, because it's like a lesson for me. So I can learn English. Sometimes you can pick up 1 or 2 words, and it really helps you. So I prefer to go with English people. So in this context, English became very, very important for the participants, and particularly those participants who managed to pick up English. They became these middlemen through which the English contractors gave orders to the laborers in the site. So they were able to translate from English to Polish to the really low-level building laborers in the construction sites. But also, through this, they also articulated that although these friendships or these associations with English contractors in the building pubs was something that was quite frequent and enjoyed by them, these people could never be their friends. So one of the participants, in fact, the same person, he said that I would not invite them for my daughter's birthday party. And in fact, he gave the example of his daughter's birthday party where he invited his daughter's friends from school, and none of them actually landed up. And the only person who landed up was her best friend, who was actually African. And he cited these as continuous examples of racism in which they were, in a way, excluded from interacting with the local population or the English population, yet at the same time they saw these people as a very big resource in gaining English language and going up the hierarchy within the building sites. Okay, now coming to the city, and this is really the main the point of this discussion, of this talk, is to think about London itself as this striated, or as I said earlier, as this fractured city, not this homogeneous mass of the iconic city made up by these landmarks, but as this fractured city. And many of these participants would talk about London as a city of villages. So here, there's one of the other participants, he says, well, here, Waterloo, London Bridge, you know these areas, because I used to work here cleaning in a bar for a month. There are quite nice buildings over here, but if you go a bit further, then you get depressed by these houses looking awfully, horribly similar. I thought London, huge city in comparison to Lublin. Lublin is not some big Polish city, but when I went to London, it felt old and small. I came here and the center is okay. It's clear that it's a big city, but the outskirts remind me of small villages linked by train lines. And this is a continuous narrative that goes across for all the participants. So London has the small place where it's a landmarks, but that's really something that they're excluded from. What makes up their everyday life in London is negotiating between the city of villages, negotiating from the suburbs into the central city center for work through the train lines. And this is again illustrated by, okay, sound is gone, doesn't matter. So most of the images that they took during traveling were images of train stations because they were staying in these outlying suburbs. And I'm calling them suburbs, but actually they're part of London, like East London is London. But they see them as largely suburbs, which also speaks about the way that they're imagining London as something that is outside and separate from. And I asked them, what is this image about? And he said, this is a way to somewhere. Oops, it's changing. So I said, what do you mean by way to somewhere? He said, but why I made, I just like this. I think it was, everything looks nice, like a way to somewhere, you know what I mean? Way to somewhere. And I said, I don't really understand. I said, way to somewhere, and I questioned. He said, exactly. And now, all of the London, one side, you can see the fantastic modernist buildings. And the other side, you have some poor, poor houses, poor buildings, making a contrast. And so they really understood London as this kind of divided city. And these lines, these train lines sort of connected them to the city that they had actually aspired to. Okay, this is, again, I think, one of the key reasons why they thought of London as disappointing. And this was, again, by one of the participants who couldn't speak English, so this was translated by my Polish interpreter. And he took quite a few images of London houses showing the rubbish in front. And he says, the next photo I wanted to talk about and present to you are these photos, actually this photo. These sites are, in East London, actually very common. And it is something that bothers me here, turns me against London. And I spoke with my friends who come to London. They imagined London differently. And it's different. Oops. Like, they land in Stansted, they come to, say, Ilford or some such eastern area, and, something gets to them. And he talks about the reasons why they experience this part of London more. But first of all, of course, as I said before, because the rents are lower, so this is the place that they can afford to stay. But also, if you compare their routes into London with, let's say, African migrants or Asian migrants that come through Heathrow, the Polish or Eastern European migrants come through the low-cost airlines. And the low-cost airlines come into the outlying airports of London, which is Stansted or Luton. And through there, they can come straight into East London without getting into central London. So that route also shapes the way that, this is what the participant is saying, shapes the way that they think about London as dirty and filthy. And there are a lot of these kind of pictures of rubbish in London. And so London, again, itself is something very disappointing. And this is, again, said in, I think the sound will come here, I hope. This is, again, shown by these two brothers who are interviewed who talked about this as nothing special. And this reminded them, actually, not of London that they had imagined, but of Poland.
It looks like in Poland.
It's the same. It's the same. Village station.
Like village station in Poland.
But it's not Poland.
No, it's London.
I never supposed to see that when I came to London. I hoped to see large buildings, everything clean, super. Yeah, but typical, usual, nothing special.
Yeah, in the city.
Yeah, maybe yes. But the outskirts of the city are the same as in Poland. There's not big difference.
No, nothing.
Nothing really special.
So this is where I think the embodied nature of it comes into play, and it's going to be reinforced by the next few slides that I'll show you, where the feelings of actually being in those places gives a very different experience of the London that they had imagined. And this is the feeling that for them then allows them to compare across national territories rather than say that they're part of London. They suggest that they feel more a part of Poland than being part of the London that they had traveled to. So just bear with me with the next ones.
Did these remind you of any other place?
Yeah, like New York.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I expect it to be bigger or something.
Here, look at me.
Yeah.
Why did you expect it to be bigger?
Because it's London, the most. When you told people from Poland that you were in London, you were, wow, really, you were in London. How's it? But you expect something bigger, something larger, something extra. Yeah, but that's nothing special, really.
Really?
You can get used to it. When you have worked, you don't really care about that place. You care about commercials or something. Yeah. Just what? I know because I work 5 days. Yeah.
So I think in the end he articulates something quite interesting, that these things you stop caring about, which you did very much so before you came to London, where it was the symbolic West. But he says, I work 5 days, so I don't really care about it. It's now irrelevant, really, for their everyday lives in the city. And that's sort of reinforced again and again through the different pictures that they show as well. These set of pictures was one day in the evening when all these young men went out together and they had a night out in the city. So they show this, and there are lots of narratives around There are other pictures that they took of them with standing around in the bus stop drinking, and they said, I don't want you to show this picture to anyone. And I said, why? He says, well, it's because it's going to reinforce this perception that Polish people are binge drinkers, and so we don't like to represent ourselves this way. It's just that we were having fun and we took this photo. So there were lots of images like that about self-representation and so on as well.
Yes, but...
Yeah, I'm reaching the final few slides now. So this was, again, about everyday mobilities and about reaching work every day. And as I said, they didn't have the car all the time. If they had their if they had their contractors taking them to work, then they would go in the car. But most often, their journey was through trains or tubes. And it was about the frustration and the materiality of this everyday life that is, again, articulated about what is it about London that they understand.
Yes, but do you know why I call this puff of snakes?
Why?
Yeah, you're never pissed off about the people that going in front of you and stopping you, and especially when you must change a train and you know that you have just only 1 minute, and all of the snakes just moving slowly on the path.
Yeah.
It is fun for me.
It's frustrating, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Sometimes. Okay, it is frustrating, but we start to laugh with this. I just look on this snakes. Okay, we're going in the same tempo. We start to laugh of this because it's not the point to be pissed off of this.
Yeah.
But yeah.
So, and then the final one.
To zdjęcie i to
I think I can talk over this because this is important.
przedstawia
So this is something again.
rozwój polskich sklepów w Londynie. Czyli ja patrzę z perspektywy czasu, cofam się powiedzmy 6 lat wstecz,
What did I do?
gdzie zdobycie jakiegoś polskiego produktu graniczyło z cudem, a w tej chwili jest tego wszędzie pełno. To jedno, co mnie cieszy.
Using buttons. Sorry, I did something funny. I can't do off, is it?
No, okay.
Home. Using buttons. Should go into the laptop. Oh, is it showing? Okay, then it's fine. Okay, so this is the final image that I wanted to show, and this to me is not just so much from the perspective of the Polish builder himself, but also what it does to the materiality of the city, the material and physical landscapes of the city, which is what this particular participant, Dariusz, is talking about. So he takes this image, and I don't know if it's very clear there, but this particular shop here, it says Grodziński, and that's a Polish shop. And this is what we saw after 2004. There's this huge proliferation of Polish shops and Polish products in London. And he says, this photo shows the development of the Polish shops in London. So I'm looking from the perspective of time. I'm going back, say, 6 years, getting a Polish product bordered on the miraculous. And so now there's plenty of it everywhere. So this is the one thing that makes me happy. And Dariusz himself had come into London as an illegal migrant. Well, he came as a tourist, but he kept working. And so after 2004, their borders opened up, and he's now working as a legal contractor. And because he came earlier, he now has a language capability. So he sees himself as quite empowered. And as you can see, he's got his own car, and he's taking the pictures from the car. And so he talks about how the presence of the Polish migrants within London itself has transformed the material and social and physical landscapes of London, which again makes it a much more embodied notion, an embodied and material notion of what the city itself means to people living here, means to the migrants who are living here, and how they actually relate and connect to different parts and spaces of the city. Oh,
you know carbon sale? Yeah. I'm mad about carbon sale.
Yeah, you like them?
I like very much. In 1989, when I started to go first time there, mostly Sundays, I visited 3 of them. One
You were buying, not selling.
no, buying. In Leytonstone, one.
Oh, yeah.
Another in Shepherd's Bush, and another in Hounslow. Then
So this is I think I wanted to put this here because it shows not just people coming into London, but also, it's not just settlement, but also return. And this particular migrant, I forget his name, he came to London again as he was illegal for many years, for about 10 years or so, before he's now become legal, before 2004. And he, again, is much more empowered. He's a contractor who employs a large number of new Polish migrants, and he has this building contracting job. But he's recently been gifted a piece of land near Krakow in the hills, and he has begun to build his house there in Poland. And he's become this real addict of visiting car boot sales all across London. And if you know these areas, they're all in different parts of London, so it's not in just one area. So he's gone to Shepherd's Bush and Hounslow and Leytonstone, and he's collecting artifacts from there. And what he says is that when he goes back to his house, when his house is built in Poland, he's going to decorate it with these artifacts that he's collecting from London. So one reason for that is, of course, because he wants to remember London, remember his time in London. Not that he wants to live in that house, but he wants to give it as a gift to his son when his son grows up. So it's not about his own living there, not about his own habitation. So it's a house built in his absence, or a house inhabited in his absence. So it's going to be decorated by these artifacts that he's collecting from the car boot sales. But also, the other reason he gives us, during the socialist era, most of that localities and locality and mobility, or situatedness and mobility, can exist in simultaneity with each other during migration. So for me, I think visuality is also a very important part of this, because not just as a methodological tool, but to me it allowed the participants to articulate their complex experiences of negotiating the spatial and temporal fracturing of their homes and their homelands. Which are often constructed as mundane and ordinary, but they are very critical to the global city narrative. And these are the narratives that are not included when we talk about transnational cities or global cities, when we talk about economic growth and remittances and all of those kinds of things which make migration studies what it is today. And so the translocal connections that are made through these visual narratives are constructed from a range of mobilities, as hopefully I have been able to show, across the nation state, across cities, across urban neighborhoods, across homes left behind and homes being made in a new place. They do show a heightened sense of situatedness, and perhaps that's to do with the nature of photographs, because their photographs are about buildings, they are about places and landscapes and people. And they show this situatedness in particular localities where connections are made through very embodied affective and material experiences that again constructs a sense of a translocal city, an embodied notion of a city rather than an imagined notion of a city for the participants. And the sustenance of everyday life through these translocal links reworks and transforms urban life in the city, which is part of the last few slides, where London itself is being changed in the perception of the participants themselves. So what does it mean to visualize the everyday city in terms of transnationalism, in terms of migration? I think beyond what we can say about translocality and the critiques that we can provide of the global city through that, the visual narratives also, I think, in their own right, they provide a creative expression to the negotiations that migrants themselves make between the imagined global city and the experienced translocal city. And the translocal connections that they make through these visual narratives are, as I said before, constructed across a range of spaces, places, and scales. And these scales are not, again, structured scales. These are scales which are continuously negotiated and constructed. For me, what was very important is that the participants were able to actually take a role in shaping the research story. And that, to me, I think is crucial in terms of doing this kind of research, where participants should have a voice. I'm not making claims to complete participatory research in this case, although I would have liked it to be. So they were not part of the research design, but they were certainly part of making the research story. So it allowed them, it gave them the opportunity to be self-reflexive and self-aware, but also highlight what was more important for them, rather than me setting the rules and rather than me imposing the framework of priorities and importance. So they were able to highlight the meanings and consequences of their own movements on their own terms through these photographs. And these photographs, therefore, they induced ideas of movement, settlement, and return, and they also allowed participants to find a sense of attachment and belonging, or create or articulate a sense of attachment and belonging within the wider notions of marginalization and alienation that they might feel, particularly in places like building sites or even in the city per se. Okay, I'll just leave some of the publications, but I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Yes, if local contexts matter, which you argue, particularly for images, the Polish immigrants, images of London, and if translocal city is your framing, then can you provide me with direct evidence in the form of spatial network maps about translocal contacts that Polish workers have in terms of daily activities? 1, working. 2, living, housing. 3, socializing, pubs. 4, shopping. Because if you provide me those maps of translocal contexts, then you could interpret those maps in terms of, are they beginning to frame London in terms of East London neighborhoods, North London neighborhoods, Earl's Court, Hammersmith, places that I used to live? I didn't see evidence about how images were being formed. I just saw results of those.
If I understand you correctly, you're asking for actual maps as in connectors. I'm trying to understand what you mean by maps, because the maps that are there are the mental maps and the ways that they narrate the connections. So if you think about the connections in terms of building site, and I couldn't show as much of those images given the scope of this, but a lot of the narratives were about the type of insulation they would use, the type of bricks in London versus concrete blocks in Poland or wherever they were familiar with. So there were all of those discussions about the difference. So the translocality or the local connections they were making often were based on a social construction of difference through which they were able to argue that Polish is better. And I've argued elsewhere that this construction was mainly based on a response to the larger marginalization that they often faced in the building sites. When it came to the homes, then often the homes, again, were about what the kinds of layouts and arrangements were there in Polish homes where people would enter, and there wouldn't necessarily be, let's say, a living room or a dining room, that each room might have a bed. And so they would talk about that, and they would say that, well, we don't really have a problem sharing homes because we have converted the dining room or the living room also into another bedroom. So there were lots of those kinds of evidences, which, of course, I can't get into in this. But, yes? Oh, I see. I see. No, this is a very qualitative research, so I wouldn't be able to show you any demographic analysis. But those kinds of data is there in the Home Office, and I certainly used a lot of that.
But if you had shown, for instance, the what you were just going through, that is the construction materials of their home villages in Poland, and then their image of superiority or inferiority of building in London, it's different if you're building in West London than if you're building in some of the if they're working in some of the high-income areas in London, and so on about trash, and so on about, shared living environments. So I would argue that localities in London do make a lot of difference about establishing perceptions, and that it is the perception, it is the reference group perception in villages in Poland, because you indicated they didn't come from Krakow, they didn't come from Warsaw, so. Or if they're moving within London.
Yeah, I think you and I are on the same page.
Between?
It's, I think what you're asking for is more of a listing of those kinds of things. And my intention was not necessarily to show a list per se, but to really see how these are both social and material. So there's a lot of social construction of it, because we can't just say that Polish is better. It was really their perception and their construction of Polishness is superior in many ways than the British, which I've argued that it was partly to do with how they were placing themselves in wider British society.
It also looks to me like that kind of data is probably available in the municipality.
Yeah.
Whereas the perception is much difficult to get.
Yes.
You need to kind of
yeah, that's where I was thinking. That's where I'm really trying to get at. I think the Home Office data, what is called the kind of the statistics, and they did keep a very strong list of the number of Polish migrants, Polish and East European migrants were coming in. So that data is very publicly available. So I used that, and there's also the construction data, which shows that after 2004 there was suddenly a big rise in the graph of the Polish and East European migrants. So there's all that data, but I didn't show that purposely because, well, there is a certain limit of time, but also my focus is more about the social construction of translocality.
Yeah, well, it was a very interesting presentation and quite interdisciplinary. But I was just wondering, now you were presenting data basically on the kind of, I would say, static environment, in the sense their existing situation. But do you find anything that they try to aspire to, I mean, in the future, like in terms of their buildings? Like now, when they construct buildings, they are big buildings, definitely. They are not small. So through those, did you see any kind of aspiration or motivation to go higher, climb higher in their social ladder? Because they start with laborers. So I didn't see anything like that coming through the presentation.
Do you have 3 hours? I saw that a lot. There was this whole section in my questionnaire or research about future and future homes. And it was very interesting because, and I alluded to that slightly, there was a lot of discussion about the future and future home and future homeland, belonging to a future homeland, through inhabitation in absence. And this was more to do with what they would leave behind for the future generations rather than inhabiting themselves. So many of them actually said that we are here, our children are studying here, we're not going to go back unless the economy changes. So it's interesting now that you hear that a lot of Polish people have actually gone back to Poland. The Polish economy is picked up and the British economy is completely slumped. So many of them would have gone back, but I think most of those whose children were younger and they had come with their children, didn't want to go back because the children were studying. So they were, like the last example I gave, they were building their houses. They were definitely interested in building. And this goes back to my answer to the last question, that they always suggested that if they were to have a house, own a house, they would own it in their homeland. And so the homeland itself was presented as superior through its very materiality. So they would say London soil is very clayey. And so the buildings have all cracks in them, and I'm really surprised how the buildings haven't fallen down. Whereas the Polish soil is mountainous, it's strong, it's got rocks, and you build something on it, it stays for years and years. And so they were all sort of making this argument about its very technical, material nature of it, but through which they were showing this kind of preference for homeland and building a home there. And so none of them were interested in buying anything in London or in the UK. they were all taking this money and investing back in Poland in a land which they were planning to build a house later, or they were buying, let's say, a flat or a house in Poland. So it was all about the future. But this was the people that I talked to, they all realized that they perhaps would never actually inhabit it. And they said, one of them actually said, this is the role of the Polish man, a house and a child and a tree. And this was a metaphor that I used in somewhere else when I was writing. And it was very interesting. It sort of showed the reproduction of family and values and family life. And this is what they saw that they were giving. And so the notion of the future, notion of aspiration and mobility was related to whether they were going to be able to build this house back home, which they would give to the future generation. The notion of mobility in the UK was about going up the ladder in the building site. And most of them saw, this is also quite interesting because some of them had actually worked in catering industries and they had moved to building because they saw building work as a craftsman's job, and some of them actually said, I'm like an artist. And I said, have you done building work before? They said, no, but I used to play the guitar. So it was more an artist craftsman work, and they could see themselves as being more independent and autonomous and going up the ladder, because if they learned English, they could really do that. So there were two sides. So social mobility in the UK wasn't so much about building a house. It was more about having a better job.
Okay, Maggie.
I think people can probably hear me, but okay. In our earlier iteration of the Skilled Migration Project, I actually looked at a sending country. I looked at in Africa, in a particular country. And what I found mirrored exactly what you just said, that notions of success in that particular country at least have to do with owning land and building a house. And you know you've made it and you're successful if you've done that, but it is so far beyond the reach of most people to be able to get jobs there. So they do in fact go places, and they either send money back to have someone save it to come back and build a house, or they send money back and have a house built, whether in fact they're going to be able to inhabit it or not. In that case, it is owning, they're so tribally oriented that, or you know, their identities, that it actually is building a house there. I'm curious if you have any sense here if it's building a house in Poland because that's the homeland and because that's their affinity and affiliation and all of those things, or if it could possibly be something a bit simpler, which is that you wouldn't be able to afford to buy a piece of land in London in a place that you'd want to be, since they're obviously very clear that there are more desirable and less desirable places, whereas in Poland perhaps they can.
Yeah, that's what I was saying in the first one, that for them, the Polish masculinity and having the tree, a house, and a child was part of that reason why they would go to Poland to build a house, because they all suggest that in London, and one of them actually said that in London, you can't build a house, you have to buy a house. So you're really restricted to these houses which are built on clay soil and cracking. And also, some of them actually linked it very explicitly to Polish masculinity, and they said, this is a Polish man's role in the family, that you build a house for your family, whereas in London, in the British society doesn't think that the man's role is to build. You know, you just buy a house and you change it every few years. It's not important. So yeah, absolutely. I think it was part of this whole narrative of, you know, simultaneously masculinity, but also to think about the future, to think about the home, to think about their role in the home. And this is also interesting in the context of what they were doing in London. They were not really building homes. They were all in the home refurbishment sector. So they said that the man's role is to build the house, but in London, their role was really painting and redecorating and carpeting and, you know, plumbing, that kind of job, which they really saw the interior to be a woman's role. So again, it sort of brings forward this juncture where they didn't see their contribution to their family or their role as a head of household in the family to be fulfilled if they would have bought something in London. Now, having said that, of course, many of them wouldn't have been able to afford. But some of them would have been, because some of them had lived for a long time. They were doing really well in terms of, you know, they were building contractors and they were hiring others and so on. So they could have if they wanted to, like the last one. But he didn't want to. He wanted to. It was about this connection between, you know, both economic possibilities, but also kind of imagined and sort of gendered roles in the family and so on.
Okay. We'll have one last question for Dr. Tickle.
Question about
I was just wondering, and you may have mentioned this actually, how do you go from a particular narrative to a generalization about a migrant group? Particular narratives are very interesting, but why should we believe that that represents a whole community?
I'm not generalizing. There were about 30 of them, and I spoke to them. And so what I'm saying is really based on what they said to me. And if I interviewed, let's say, if I interviewed Polish migrants in the catering sector, for example, their aspirations and their wishes would be very different, and the way they would articulate their imaginations of London would probably be quite different. So no, I'm not generalizing at all. I'm basing it on this notion of what was said to me through the construction of the city. But having said that, I think there is something to be aware of what they're saying. And so even if this was one person saying this, I don't think we can discount it. To me, what it shows really is a process through which a city is understood, people's perceptions and people's own positionality and subjectivity in relation to the city is negotiated. So that is what I am talking about, rather than saying all Polish migrants do this. So it's a slightly different position.
Although Dr. Datta started by saying, I don't know if this talk is relevant for this conference, Migration and Language, I think, first of all, a lot of people are expanding their notion of language to a multimodal, semiotic system, and the visuals are part of communication. It's a kind of language. Moreover, narratives are important areas that we are concerned about. But more specifically, just a food for thought as we move for lunch, the way in which these Polish immigrants, I consider part of the story as how they appropriate London, how they make London Poland, so to speak. If that is the case, so one reading, it's my linguist reading of the story. I think a lot of people do this with language also, by using Polish in London. And a lot of migrants do that all the time. Penn State, for me, has a lot of spaces for Tamil, and that's how I make State College Jaffna, my hometown. But so if that's one way to go, I think there's a lot of implications for how people use language as part of their visualization, as part of their imagination in making spaces something they own. I don't know, something if you would agree.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's interesting. And I had never actually reflected on this till I came to this 3-day meeting, that my whole reasoning behind starting to do with visual, starting with photographs was to overcome the language barrier, because I realized that I wouldn't be able to ask them to articulate in the way I would with my other research. Because I've done research in London where people would speak in English, and in India where people would speak in Hindi, and that was not a problem because I could understand the cultural implications. So it was all about language, and suddenly I realized that yes, it has got so much to do, and it was a way of communication. But once that was done, I thought it became more than just language. It's like we were talking about before, that it's this other repertoire of meanings that is associated, that goes beyond just the text of it all. So it did become an alternative or a parallel form of communication, yeah.
Let's thank Dr. Datta for the very informative talk. So we have lunch right outside.